Hi, everybody at Hot Springs Wesleyan. It's great to be with you, even if being with you means I'm with you digitally, but great to get a chance to say hi. Pastor Keegan tells me some really cool things that's happening in Hot Springs and in your church community. I love the way you're growing and growing together, and so it's my privilege to get to say hi to you today. Your pastor's given me the privilege today to teach about a topic that's become a passion area for mine, a real personal conviction area for mine, as I have the role of superintending and leading the churches in our region. And it's this idea that the church has been really challenged over the last couple of years. We as people have been really challenged over the last couple of years, right? But especially as we try to lead churches and stay together as church bodies, we've been really challenged during this COVID era. And I've witnessed something happen that I'd really like the chance to challenge you about today. You know, Jesus said in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, the gospel writer John, he records Jesus saying this. I want to read that to you because I'm not sure we as a church body are always getting this right. And I want to talk to you as a church person and just as a person, obviously. But let me read this to you. It says, Jesus says, "So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other in this way." Okay, verse 35. "Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." Boy, that's been tested lately, hasn't it? It's been hard for us to stay united. It's been hard for our amazing care and love for each other to be so evident to the world that it's kind of shocking, which is what Jesus intended for it to be. That's been really tested. I personally witnessed some horrific moments in church these last few years. Like I was in one meeting and they had to bring law enforcement in just for my protection in the meeting. It was quite intense. Another meeting, there was some violent stuff that went down, like ambulances had to be called. We haven't necessarily always gotten this right in the church, right? Like this has been a challenging time, but more subtly and honestly, maybe even more tragically, I've watched friends who've been like friends in the church for decades separate what seems to be permanently. I've watched families be torn apart, children estranged from their parents. Yeah, it's been tough. I know it's been incredibly difficult to pastor these last few years. I would say maybe more difficult than it's ever been, but at least in my lifetime, it's been really difficult to pastor. The decisions you're faced with, they're no-win decisions. How to address political stuff, how to address what's going on in culture, what decisions to make about boundaries as it relates to COVID. All these decisions have come at, and no matter what decision your pastor makes, they know it's going to upset a group of folks. It's just been brutal, and the criticism and the stream of challenge has been like never before, in my opinion. So I want to remind us today about what Scripture has to say about who we are to be, about this love that Jesus said would be so like different and amazing and shocking that the world would say, oh, that must be the real thing. That's got to be like from God. Like that's different. That's the real thing. So in 1 Corinthians, which is a section of Scripture I know you've read or heard about because it's the classic teaching about love. Paul really does a brilliant job of explaining like how we are to be in our era of time in 1 Corinthians. So let's start in verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 13 and just read together, and maybe you'll be as challenged as I have been. "Love is patient. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged." Does that describe you? Does that describe like the small group that you're in? the church dinner that you're part of, the committee, whatever. Right? Does that describe you? I've really been challenged about whether that's described to me over the last couple of years. I think sometimes it does, but sadly, not always. Not always. I was challenged. My son and my son's new in the ministry, and he was writing one of his first sermons. And we were doing the work together on that. And he came across a quote from Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard was just a tremendous spiritual teacher. And he came across a quote. Dallas asked, what one word would you use to describe Jesus' leadership, his ministry and leadership life? And then he just gave us some time to think through what one word. And we thought, powerful, loving, you can think of a lot of words. Then Dallas picks a word that at first I disagreed with, and now I've come to think he's exactly right on. And that word is relaxed. Our world is not relaxed, right? Like we do not live in a relaxed conversation, a relaxed world. And Jesus faced incredible polarization, incredibly big, difficult issues. And yet it is true that maybe the best way to describe his life and leadership is relaxed. Think about the time he's on a boat. There's a storm that's terrifying everybody, people who spend their life on boats. What's Jesus doing? He's taking a nap. He's taking a nap. Yeah. Think about other times. Jesus is presented with all kinds of criticism, challenges, and his response is often simple. So sometimes he'll tell a story. It's powerful. It's courageous. But he lives his life in a very relaxed way. And he has a team of people. His core team is difficult. He's in a world that's incredibly challenged in that it's at odds politically. Take taxation, for instance. Jesus lived in an era where taxation was brutal. It literally killed people. It was so extreme. And Jesus would be asked to take a stand and make bold statements about it, and he wouldn't. He wouldn't. His way of dealing with this issue, by the way, you remember this? The main way he engaged in the idea of taxation was one day he invited a tax collector to dinner. Actually invited himself over. He said, hey, Zacchaeus, can I have dinner at your house? Which shocked the people around, shocked Zacchaeus, but he just has dinner with him. And it changes that community. It changes Zacchaeus, and it changes that community because once Zacchaeus got a chance to meet Jesus, he gave his life in dedication to God, changes the way he does taxation. It changed the world. Jesus changed the world. But he did it differently. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not rude. Love is not irritable. What's your irritability quotient these days? What's your IQ, your irritability quotient? How much does it take you to get mad right now? Maybe something to think about, right? A mentor of mine, this has got to be 20 years ago maybe, shared a parable with me from the natural world that's really stuck with me. And I haven't always gotten it right, but I tried. It comes up in my mind often. He talked about oysters and the way they produce pearls. You probably know this. Oysters produce these magnificent, considered to be just one of the most amazing things that the natural world produces, these pearls that are just beautiful. But do you know it takes about 20 years for an oyster to produce a pearl? Oysters typically live up to 40 years, and at most they'll produce 2 pearls in their whole lifetime. And the oyster needs 2 things to produce this magnificent thing: time and an irritant. It's in response to an irritant that the oyster produces the pearl. And we can sort of fake produce pearls, like we can get pearls that look pretty good, But to produce something great, it requires the oyster to have time and an irritant. Do you have an irritant? Are there some things you're irritated about? If so, thank God. He's given you a gift. Maybe the person you're with right now is God's gift to you as your irritant. Don't say that, but you can think it maybe. Because I know they are, right? I'm sure they are. But to produce the great thing God hoped for in your life, you need patience. It's going to take some time. And you're going to need an irritant, because that's going to produce in you the kind of patient love that God intended for you all along. Now, for me to start applying this in my life, I've had to get real intentional about where I take my cues from. I watch the news less. There's certain things I read less. I've had to start being real intentional about making sure I take my cues from God and from people that I put in my life, the church community I'm intentional about spending time with, so that I'm getting my cues from God. I'm not getting my cues from the world around me, because the world around me tends to make me become a polarized person, because I have strong opinions about a lot of stuff, right? And that's okay. But I have to take my cues from God. And the way I'm doing that is making sure I limit the inputs about these kinds of things from the outside world and get a lot of cues from my time with God, from building into my life regular times when I'm with church community. It's so important now more than ever. So that's just something that's making a difference for me, and you probably will need to evaluate that in your life. I want to finish my point today by telling you a story of a fourth grade class. Therapist Jim Roberts writes about a time when he went to visit his fourth grader at school. And he wrote about this several years ago, and it's just stuck with me because I think it's the picture of who we are to be. So he says he went to his fourth grade class and just observed a time when in his son's class, the teacher gave them a break. And to give them a break, kind of an activity break, they tied balloons to a string that was tied around their foot, each of them. And the teacher said the goal is to try to pop each other's balloon without your balloon being popped, and we'll see who's the last person to still have a balloon. And he said what he observed was like Darwinian. Like, it was brutal. He said it was as a free-for-all as you would expect. Some of those kids like immediately just opted out. Like, they committed balloon suicide. They just popped their balloon, stood off to the side, and didn't want any part of it. And it kind of became this deal where who could bully the others the most. And turns out, yeah, what you'd expect. The strongest, most competitive, biggest, most aggressive ones had the balloons that were left. And eventually there was one victor, and everybody was, done, but a little beat up as a result. Then he said he watched, as the day went on, this same classroom brought in a group of intellectually challenged children. They were different ages, not just fourth graders, but they had kind of been put together, so a few grades had been put together. And he kind of was concerned because the teacher decided to do the same game with them and explained the game as best teacher could. The kids get their balloons, they finally get them blown up and tied around their feet. And the game starts. But it went radically differently. The intellectually challenged kids didn't understand the whole game. What they thought the idea is to help each other pop each other's balloons. And so politely and one at a time, they would hold their balloons up and somebody else would pop their balloon, and then the other person would hold their balloon up and their balloon would be popped. And different ages were helping each other, and each time both had their balloons popped, there'd be a celebration, and eventually the whole class had their balloons popped and they all cheered. I think that's the church. You see, our world is a world like the first fourth grade class. And you've got to be aggressive and strong and loud. And you've got to defend, and some opt out, but some aggressive. Not the church. The church is a place where we come together as very imperfect people, and we unite around this idea that God sent his only begotten Son, who did not come to seek anything for himself, but was patient and kind with us. And we are to be that with one another, caring and serving. And I'm telling you something, I'm seeing this start to happen all across our region. Like with the network of our churches, I'm seeing a new church be reborn. It's a new church. It's a church full of people who have said, there's some things we'll probably have to agree to disagree on, but that won't be our topic. Our topic will be Jesus Christ and his love for us and our love for one another. And we'll give up some of our priorities for his priority. And they're coming together. It actually seemed to start with most of our poorer churches, some of our more desperate churches, some of our churches that if they didn't band together, they weren't going to survive. But I'm seeing this spread across our region. And I'm seeing a new church be reborn. And it's being reborn again on this great foundation of Jesus Christ and his love for us. And they're becoming known, even in the most desperate places, they're becoming known as the group of people who care for and love one another. So in 2022, I'd invite you to be part of a reborn church that really is the only hope for our world.